Welcome to episode 55 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This episode, I had the pleasure to speak to Dr. Romina Akemi, who is an assistant professor in history at Washington and Lee University. Her current book project is titled To Govern is to Educate, Modeling Racial Education in Modern Chile, 1879 to 1920. In this episode, Dr. Akemi speaks on Chile, Anarchism, Violeta Parra, Feminism, and Indigenous solidarity. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
I know the kind of pain you're feeling, Alex. I once had it myself.
You some kind of doctor?
No, Alex. I am Magneto, and I have come to offer you sanctuary.
Hello, this is our jingle for our podcast, The Grounded Futures Show.
This is the show where we discuss topics ranging from climate change to identity to how youth can gain new skills to thrive amid current and ongoing disasters that we are collectively facing. We are your hosts, one Gen Z Liam and one Gen X Carla. And we think we all deserve to thrive now and not in some distant utopian future.
Yeah, but that's in the future. Oh, I hate the future.
Yeah, we're with Bolin. Grounded Futures is a larger project, so check that out over at groundedfutures.com.
I was wondering if you can talk about a transformational moment or moments when you started questioning the dominant narrative of white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy and thinking deeper on the topics that you are engaged in now.
Well, I think I might be a little unusual because I grew up in a very leftist family. So I didn't go through an adult transformation. I was already, you can say, indoctrinated from a very young age. So, from my Chilean family, several family members were involved in the Communist Party, and also being told, I lived in Chile as a child during the dictatorship. And my Chilean grandmother was very open about what happened to our family when the government came, like what life was before, what is the Allende government. And also, my father was part of the anti-war movement in the U.S., meaning the war in Vietnam. So I think I already had my political ideas kind of already formed before I was 12, which is more unusual with most of the people that I've met through my political activities. I think I've met a lot of people that had these aha moments later on.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really liked the article that you wrote about doing garment work in Birmingham and your coworker Clarissa, who would bring you.
Oh, yeah.
I love that story. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the how you kind of fell into organizing. How you wrote it was kind of like an organic action that opened up.
Yeah, I dropped out of college after a year and a half or 2 years, and I was in community college, like a couple of different community colleges. And I think the reason, partly what I dropped out, I think there's a combination of, one, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, and also most of the teachers and professors I encountered, either in elementary school, high school, or even early college, were not very, they were not encouraging whatsoever. So I didn't see a point of staying there. And then I wanted to be truly involved in something that I felt that not just living the theoretical life, but actually experiencing it and being part of the struggle. So I joined a socialist organization, and part of their work was doing a turn to industry. And I moved from Los Angeles to Alabama to work in a garment factory. And that was the first garment factory I worked in, and I worked in several afterwards. But my friendship with Clarissa, and at the time I was really young, and she's probably at the time, she's probably my age now. I owe a lot to even all the reading that you do is very different from experiencing it on the job and having to react and do things. And I think those hands-on experiences of working in factories and doing that kind of labor organizing, not as someone I wasn't organizing through the official unions. if there was a union in the workplace, my goal was to make it more radical. If there was no union in the workplace, the goal was to have a union. So I was coming at it from a very different perspective, not from like as a Unite Here organizer. But yeah, it's, I think Clarissa is just one of many coworkers, many female coworkers who taught me a lot of things through those experiences, through surviving these workplaces that are pretty intense, and then garment workplaces are also open to a lot of sexual harassment from male supervisors and owners. So they protected me, I would say, and gave me really good advice.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that story. And I was a dock worker for many years on forklifts, and I wasn't, like, when the union would come, it was really aggressive with how the bosses were like, you can't go to the parking lot and talk to them or you would get fired. And yeah, I know what you mean when it's so different from reading to when you're like confronted with, I might lose my job and my livelihood if I challenge this. It's hard situations.
There's more to negotiate there. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering what kind of got you into anarchism and anarchist thought?
I think I have a very kind of love-hate relationship with anarchism. I don't fully identify, maybe because I came to it older, and I've had some really bad experiences in that political world. But what opened me to aspects of anarchist thought, I would say, was the Occupy movement. And through being part of Occupy Boston, which I was living there at the time, I met a lot of folks who are anarchists, and I got to see aspects of anarchist thinking enacted in certain ways in these spaces, right? So that, to me, kind of like opened my eyes to other possibilities and other forms of organizing. And I have very good, I met from there, before my world was, very much within like the socialist Trotskyist world. And after that, being open and meeting a lot of folks who are various types of anarchists, anarchist communists, anarchist, there are feminists who are anarchists. And it has been, it's a space that I have a lot of like friends, and I feel like I have, some extent of political commonality. But, at the same time, I don't see myself as entirely like, I don't hold it as a personal identity. I see political involvement not as like an identity of self. It's like I will be involved in spaces that I think are doing good work and are going to make a difference. And if you're not, I don't have to, stay, like I don't have to remain a Trotskyist forever if I feel like the political party I was involved in is not doing good things anymore. And the same thing I feel about a lot of anarchist spaces. So that's sort of, I would think that best describes my relationship.
Yeah, like escaping a dogma of a certain thought and going where you can help people. And seeing anarchism as like a set of ideas or a tool.
Yeah, because I've met a lot of people who seem to really ascribe to the identity, like the T-shirts of this, everything is anarchist, and I don't fall in that category.
Mm-hmm. I would think that would be like even like a truer definition of like an anarchist or autonomous thought.
Yeah, maybe in the 19th century sense of, because one thing I found really interesting when I read about some anarchist activists in the 19th century, at least a few that I'm thinking of, is that there was a lot more crossing over with the socialist movement, and they read each other's work and they collaborated on some things together, which I think now there is a huge separation.
Yeah.
As treating these spaces as entirely different, socialists don't like trust anarchists. Anarchists view all socialists as authoritarian and not worth even collaborating with. So yeah, I don't think that's healthy or helpful.
Mm-hmm. My next question is I wanted to talk a little bit about your chapter, Unearthing Violeta Parra, counter memory, rupture, and authenticity outside of the modern. And it's a really great chapter. I learned a lot from it. And I was wondering if you could talk about how, of the many things that she did, about her contribution to collective memory and unearthing her own culture and using oral history to recover folk songs.
Yeah, thank you. Violeta Parra, I think the more I learn about her, the more I'm in awe of everything she did and accomplished. She, is a very famous folk singer from Chile. She's from kind of the south central region, and she was mixed race, which is also something that Chileans are still. My area is race politics in Chile, but it's still a complicated kind of like area of work because it's very new. And Violeta she really captures this person who took on as a personal project first to make sure that the music, the rural music where she grew up with, was going to stay alive. And on top of that, she fused it with class politics. And also, I would say race politics, too, because she definitely has some songs that talk specifically about the indigenous Mapuche struggle. And she also used words in Mapudungun, which is the Mapuche language, because her grandmother on her mother's side was Mapuche. Through doing this as a personal project, she collected these songs, and then she also had some small radio shows that they were first not widely broadcasted, but then became more popular, where she would play this music. And at first, she was just compiling the music and playing stuff that she had, learned. But over time, she started to create her own type of music and also write her own songs that were highly political. And she was the first person at this moment in Latin America to fuse rhythms and instruments from different regions. That prior, these songs and these rhythms were seen as just specifically to the region, the quena, which dates back to the Incan Empire and Aymara as well. So it's Quechua and Aymara. It's a type of flute, but she brought in the quena and played it along with a Mapuche drum, which hadn't been done before, right? So this kind of fusing kind of eventually led to this experimentation along with a very political music that we call new song, but it's also called, music with consciousness. And it motivated a lot of singer-songwriters, not just in Chile, but throughout Latin America, to do similar projects. And I would say that it really transformed the musical landscape, really matching also the political landscape of Latin America. And there are some artists who tried to do that in the United States and who did do that to a certain extent, but unfortunately they just never became extremely famous. You only know them through leftist circles in the U.S. But in Chile, she's a household name.
Thank you so much for breaking that open.
Sure. I love her.
Another question I had was on how Violeta's music challenged patriarchy and her style, a la poeta, and you had written about how it broke gender and music barriers, singing the allo humano and the travesura, and just kind of those concepts that you were talking about that really broke these barriers.
Yeah, I think she broke barriers also by just being a kind of very public musical artist in a time when a lot of women folk singers were being treated more as background singers or sort of maybe supplementary to the main male musical act. Within that, you also have her playing the guitarrón, which is a very it's a large guitar with many, many strings, and had been popularly been seen as only a guitar that men play. She learned it from her father because her father was a musician. And she also made sure that not just her son, but her daughter would also learn to play the guitarrón. So her just playing the guitarrón publicly was also this gender statement. And she did write a little bit about questions of I would say if she wrote anything about women, it wasn't specifically the topic, but maybe it was intertwined with other topics. And I think it's something that she really struggled with because she was someone who I think was very confident in herself, both as a woman and also like seeking sexual partners. Like she had several husbands, several partners. In the end, her last partner, who was a man from Switzerland, a white man from Switzerland, she met while on tour in Europe, emotionally broke her, and he's very much linked to her eventual suicide. So she's someone who both has this like story of great resilience, of confronting patriarchy, confronting gender norms, and also someone who became a victim of it too.
Thank you for breaking that open. And after reading your chapter, I watched the movie Violeta Went to Heaven, which was a really powerful movie too.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's a very good movie, and it does capture that. I think also that emotional difficulty she experienced in the end.
Yeah, that part is so sad. The end of the movie. So my next question was kind of what you were speaking to earlier about this cross collaboration between Marxists and anarchists, and it seems like this was really seen in Chile and the revolutionary dimension of the working class struggle. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about some of that collaboration, and I think you had written about how the IWW was in Chile in the 1920s as well.
Yeah, there has been a historical collaboration. The IWW had the biggest impact in among port workers in the northern region of Iquique. They became quite large in Chile at a time when they were dwindling in the United States, but dwindling in the United States because of government repression, right? So there's that. But also there is an organization that was formed in the late 60s called Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionario, or Revolutionary Left Movement, or known as MIR. When it was founded by folks from different political ideologies. You had anarchists, you had Trotskyists, probably had some sort of like Guevarist folks there, or maybe not Guevarist, but Fidelis, something like that. That's always there in Latin America. And I think it really molded why that organization was so different, obviously, from the Chilean Communist Party and some others. But it became a really, really important force during the 60s, but especially in accelerating politics during the UP government, the Popular Unity government of Salvador Allende, the socialist president who was in power before he was overthrown by a military coup. So a lot of the organizing that they did, that the MIR did, I think it had a lot to do with the acceleration of like workers taking over factories, land occupations in the South. And some people always wonder, how does an organization that was created by college students become a majority organization of working class people? Not just in the North, in Santiago, you had a lot of factory workers who joined MIR. You had a shanty town that was organized by the MIR. And in the South, you have indigenous Mapuche who joined. So how does that happen, right? And obviously it was because they were just really good organizers. And some people, one of my former professors said, they were always being accused of being guerrilla fighters. He's like, they were not good military people, like fighters, but they were good organizers, which is true. And I think the legacy of that kind of mixed ideology, I think you can see it still today in Chile with one of the organizations that I have a lot of close collaboration is one that's called Solidaridad in Chile. And one of the things that they have like politically kind of focused on was that you can join our organization, but we're not anchored in a specific ideology. If you see yourself as primarily feminist, if you see yourself as socialist, as autonomous, as anarchist, as some sort of Marxist, whatever. But what matters is if you agree with the political work that we seek out to do. And if you agree with that political work, and that is our center, this is where we're going to begin. And that's how they've also created collaborations with other organizations, like where do we have commonality? Where can we do work together? And that's how I think has a lot to do with the strength of the social movements in Chile, of being radical and also ideologically, not entirely connected to one specific organization. Obviously, the Communist Party in Chile doesn't see it that way. They're not good at collaborating. So they're but the social movements in Chile are huge, and most of them have very little connection to the Chilean Communist Party.
And are a lot of these same social dynamics what really contributes to the large domestic worker unions in Chile as well?
The domestic workers union, unfortunately, there's two unions, one for Chileans and one for non-Chileans. So you can always see kind of like a racialized and kind of, it's problematic, right? And they also they haven't had that much support. The feminists have supported them, but the feminists are also, I think, struggling with race politics and immigrant politics. All of that is sort of new to them. So there's maybe some feminist collective that does work with them and help them, and then other feminist collectives who might just retweet or post something in support. But I think that is still being figured out, even though I think the domestic workers, both unions, have been able to have a lot of discussions and collaboration with folks who are part of the current Constituent Assembly for the new, when they were writing the draft of the new Constitution. So hopefully through the new Constitution, if it is passed on September 4th, that it would give domestic workers a little bit more legal ability to organize and also maybe no longer have two separate unions.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the tactics that are used to spread information. I know one thing I've heard a lot about in Chile and Brazil is the theater of the oppressed. Have you worked with them or just some experiences of that?
Actually, I was just trying to figure out how to do something next semester in my school, theater of the oppressed. The feminist group that I was connected to, that I'm not really sure if they still exist anymore because, they've gone through a lot of generations of different people in and out. But some years back, when I was connected to them, there's a group in Chile, they used theater of the oppressed in their collaboration with the domestic workers union as a way to give them confidence and be able to understand and do politics. I had a really interesting discussion with an Argentinian friend about not just questions of theater of the press, but also liberation theology. And one thing that we kind of came to terms with, in Latin America, we feel like some of that stuff it's okay, but a lot of times we feel like that's sort of passé. But we find that to be people in the United States need it. They need it. They even need to read about liberation theology. They need to read Pedagogy of the Press. They need to read all that. I think because a lot of the stuff that we've already internalized and have debated and discussed in Latin America, so we feel like we've already evolved from that. Well, I think that I am always surprised that these kind of methodologies of especially using theater of the press, it's something that always feels much more groundbreaking here in the U.S. I would say it's not extraordinarily popular anymore as it was in Latin America, but everyone has a connection with it, knows it, and maybe has used it at some point, especially if they were younger. And they might use it still, especially theater of the press, because it's evolved in different ways. That you can use it as sort of instead of doing here in the U.S. what people do, icebreakers, you might do that instead as a way to kind of set the stage to discuss politics.
Okay, thank you. My next question was if you could talk about some of the internationalism or solidarity of anarcho-feminists or just feminists between Chile and other countries. I read one example in the book of the Chilean anarchist Flora Sanhueza, who went to Spain in 1935 and worked with the Mujeres Libres. Some of the internationalism that you see that's productive. And one example is the Black Rose anarcho-feminist panel that you held in 2015, I felt was one really good example of that. I learned a lot from that panel.
Yeah, I think feminists, not just in Latin America, but across America, had a great deal of collaboration, especially in the 1920s, especially in the 1930s, at the height of the Popular Front politics. And actually, there's a really great book that captures a lot of this collaboration called Feminism for the Americas by Catherine Marino. I actually use it in one of my classes because it's just so beautiful. It's about this collaboration. Our collaboration today doesn't even touch what it used to be. And I've been thinking a lot about, when I read that book, I was just thinking about that. Why do we have so little, we might, and I mean political collaboration, not as in what I think internationalism has become in more recent years is like a statement of support, right? This collaboration that was done in the 1930s was very much rooted in anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, and also carried out joint projects and such, right? So they were able to collaborate with, like a feminist in Panama and Cuba and Chile and Argentina, and they were able to do things like fight for maternity leave rights, and they would build and inform each other and help each other. And definitely that doesn't exist. I think I've always tried because I'm I guess naturally a transnational person, being Chilean and from the U.S. both, that I've always sought that, and I've always struggled to maintain that and struggled to get those things done. I think a lot of people just don't have the discussions about what that internationalism work really means, and beyond just a statement of support, or just beyond just knowing a couple of people from different countries. Can we create and do something together that has, some kind of political impact? Because I always say that we can do these political work in Chile, but we cannot have a revolution in Chile, because if we just do a revolution in Chile, we know that the United States will be involved. We know that what's going to stop them from, doing what they have done before. And the only thing that can stop them would be more regional collaboration, have some kind of much more support, but we just don't have it. I think there needs to be a lot of rethinking of what that means and what actually true internationalist work really means.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, building those bridges, and thanks for the work you have done with that. It's inspiring.
Good. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk about the feminist movement in Chile in the 1980s that was rising up against the dictatorship. I've heard that it was growing at that time, and that was really militant too. And
yeah, it's interesting because the embrace of the term feminism happened in Chile in the midst of the dictatorship in the 1980s, and it didn't happen, let's say, in Argentina the same way, right? The forefront of resisting the dictatorship was the mothers of the disappeared, and some of the mothers who, are still alive and are politically active today would say now, now if we reflect back, that we can say that some of our work was feminist. It's not how we understood it. And also a lot of Latin American women who did political work in the region, a lot of them took distance from feminism because they saw it as just U.S. and European, and what does that mean? So it is interesting that in Chile we actually had a feminist movement that used the name and embraced it, and their main political work was to resist the military dictatorship, because the military dictatorship, being a very patriarchal, military, misogynistic dictatorship, it gave women a political space to do work that men didn't have. And not that women weren't repressed and killed and murdered, but in contrast to Argentina, women were killed much less in percentages than the men. In Argentina, it was equal in terms of who the military dictatorship killed, which sort of makes sense why mothers and the image of mothers and women who, were in that position were able to carve out space in a way that a woman who was a feminist college student could not in Argentina, but they could in Chile, right? So those are just like some slight differences in the dictatorships. But the feminist movement, I think, has a lot to do with our legacies in Chile of having not just a feminist movement that is anti-fascist, that we can even say they date back to the 1930s, but also a feminist movement that is rooted in class politics and is not afraid to engage with those subjects, right, and to center that. So and they did amazing work. Some of those women did disappear and were killed. Some of them were arrested. But if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have been able to carve out a lot of space, even though it's not just them. It was also a lot of young people from the shanty towns that also helped tilt, the rebellion against the dictatorship in the 1980s. But, yeah, I would say that even today we're always, and when we feminist activities are done, we always give homage to their work in the 1980s.
Thank you. My next question was in the panel that you were part of. You spoke about your experience at the 40th anniversary of 9/11 in Chile, which was the U.S.-backed coup, as you mentioned, in DNF March, and you spoke about how the political is social. And I was wondering if you could expand on that kind of learning lesson thing that you were speaking about.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what I said on that panel. It was so many years ago. Was I talking about the political, the social political, and the social space, like those three different spaces?
Yeah, and I think you were also saying that in the U.S. there's a lot of talk about intersectionality, but in Chile, it's not so much needed because there's a lot of cross-solidarity and those boundaries kind of break down.
Well, I would say it's not necessarily not needed, but they use a different language for it, and they see it differently. Yeah, so part of, I think, the way that we analyze organizing spaces, and this is something that's been I would say very basic in Chile of the way we see things, is that there are organizations that are political, there are organizations that are social political or political social spaces, and then there's social spaces. And the social spaces are like the labor unions or a mass bigger union that might not be, that's usually not aligned politically. So in the U.S. it could be just a regular trade union. Now, the IWW in the U.S. would definitely be a social political space because it kind of touches on both. It would be a space that wants to be a union, but at the same time has certain ideological convictions that it maintains, right? And then political spaces are obviously referring to political organizations, and those are, they can be, like a Marxist political organization. And obviously, it can even be the Democratic Party, whatever, those spaces. And understanding the role of each of those kind of political spaces, our engagement with it, where we could sit. We could sit in a political organization and a social organization, right? We can be in those two separate spaces, and how we engage with them both is really important to understand. I think that's a really good foundation to understand our role and what we're doing in spaces, what we want to accomplish. And then the other thing that you mentioned about the question of intersectionality, people know the term mainly because of the impact of U.S. academia, right? So people are aware of a lot of stuff. They might arrive 10 years or 15, 20 years later in Latin America because they have to be translated, and you have to have a generation of people who are exposed to it, right? So the discussions happen, I would say, a little later, but also there's other discussions happening that don't seem to flow into the U.S., right? And one thing about intersectionality that is viewed is that not in the original, the original kind of language of intersectionality, but I would say it's more about what intersectionality has become in the U.S. over time is where we differ in Latin America, right? Because when something there's terms or political terms that are written and are explained at a certain moment that used to tend to be much more complex, And then everyone wants to use it, and then it sort of like muddles and, like down their meaning to just be whatever. Like the word postmodern, right? It means a lot of different things, but it means a lot of different things because there's been a zillion conversations about it, right? So the same thing with intersectionality. And I think the way that it's become and understood in Chile is that now we see it as like, oh, that's sort of like an individual interpretation of like how are we supposed to use that in our social political space, right? And instead, we've kind of used like this other kind of like we've looked at how to create solidarity across organizations, right? And through the solidarity across organizations, maybe it's intersectional, but it's not like it's the purpose of it is also to find and to strengthen the social movements, right? So I would say like it feels in Chile when we look at these things, it has like a political purpose rather than a sounding like like I don't know. I just feel that when sometimes I'm talking to people and they're offering critiques of various like individuals in history, those critiques don't have political purpose. They're just showing how nuanced and radical they are, right? Mm-hmm. They're like, these are my critiques of this. But what's the point of those critiques unless we can use them? And what's the point of being intersectional unless we have a way to actually use it in our social movements? Is it just because you're like, oh, this is not intersectional enough, but yet you're not going to do anything because you're just like critiquing something? Or are you actively trying to figure out what does that mean in the day-to-day political practices? I don't know, is that an answer?
Yeah, no, that definitely. Thank you. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of how academia will take a lot of words and then kind of neutralize them. Like I see that going on with terms like decolonization. Right now, a lot of universities using the term, and instead of, having it used in like the same vein as land back or something, it's turning into like decolonizing language arts or something like that. And
yeah, and then you're like, what does that mean? Like concrete. Like, what are you going to do?
Yeah, thank you very much. So you were talking about translation from stuff taking a while to get from the U.S. to Chile. I was wondering, what are some things from Chile or Latin America that you would hope would get translated into the U.S. and take some more root that would be helpful for, so-called U.S. and Canada?
I would say that folks I'd like to see a lot more available translations of a lot of the statements and political, I would say, manifestos and political analysis done by the feminist movements in Latin America. They're all like slightly different, in Argentina. You have some like amazing stuff, not just by the group Ni Una Menos, that organizes against femicide, but also there's been some really interesting stuff about like feminist economy. And actually in the government of Argentina, in the Department of Economy or the Ministry of Economy, there's a woman who comes from that field. And so she's been able to like impact in terms of policies, highlighting gender issues and other issues when they do like their economic analysis in Argentina. And I've learned a lot from just reading and analyzing that, and also the political language, that the evolution of the political language, like the use of the word femicide and why that and not domestic violence, right? Why femicide is seen as like a political term and domestic violence is seen like a personal and private term, right? And so this evolution of language that I think has taken many decades, but I think even when I've explained it to people here, some of these terms, like, I don't know, I feel I get sort of like lukewarm interest, and I'm like, oh, that's nice, but, whatever. And even with feminists, I've tried to. I think more recently, I've had students who become much more receptive, I think because of the attacks in the U.S. against Roe and other things, that they're kind of like, oh, maybe we do need something else. So So I've just noticed like there's been more reception now than all my attempts in the past from folks. So yeah, and also like queer language is very different in Latin America too. And there's just, I mean, it would take definitely some studying to really understand it, you know, because it's not just understanding what a term is defined as, but how is it used and how is it used slightly different between like Chile and Bolivia, for example, right? So yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff that hasn't been translated.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Just had a few more questions. I was wondering if you could, I was reading in the Anarchism in Latin America that the Winca anarchists supported indigenous demands in Chile. I was wondering if you could talk about some other groups or people who have been working in solidarity with indigenous communities for land and autonomy movements.
Yeah, there has been anarchists, and that's referring to recent, like the last 20 years, anarchists in Chile who have supported the more militant autonomous indigenous Mapuche movements. And you do see some crossovers in different places. Like there is a indigenous feminist organization that's been around for a long time in Bolivia called Mujeres Creando, Women Creating, and they identify as like sort of they identify more with anarchism, I would say. This is the way how I would phrase it. I don't know if they necessarily use the term, but they see themselves more in that political space. And I think the reason why there is a lot of connection is the question of anti-state politics and land autonomy, right? And obviously, you can't put all indigenous movements as a monolith, right? Because even in Chile, there's different sectors. So I would say that they support, the way that they find commonality is the more militant sector of the Mapuche movement that doesn't want to negotiate with the state. But there are other organizations that do in different extents and in different ways. But yeah, I think people could see, if they understand the politics, why there would be a crossover.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is my last question. I was wondering where people can find your work and what you're working on right now.
Sure. I think if you just Google my name, you probably will find a few sites that from academia.edu that has and most of my other social media stuff I keep private because I'm just not interested in engaging with the mass world in that way. But my current stuff that I'm working on the special issue co-editing with Joshua Frenstring for the journal NACLA. That is going to be about the uprising in 2019 in Chile and the new constitution. So there's going to be some really interesting articles that are going to touch on questions that are usually sort of ignored, like migration movement, the indigenous Mapuche movement and labor and stuff, and the significance of this new constitution, right? And other stuff I'm working on is about, I'm kind of revisiting some of my work about the feminist movement in Argentina because I realized how useful that could be for the U.S. context. So I'm working on some of it's research that I had done previously some years back, but it's about the early kind of like re-rise of a feminist movement in the late 90s, early 2000s, and had a more class character and how that changed Argentine feminism. And the last thing I'm working on, which is like kind of my ongoing project, was my book project, which is about 19th century race politics in Chile. So that's sort of like ongoing, kind of like I'm re-outlining and redrafting my dissertation. But hopefully I want to make it open up the discussion about race politics in Chile because it's largely ignored, which seems surprising because in Latin America, we also have, racism and histories of racial hierarchies, but Chile definitely has embraced this idea that to be Chilean is to have no race. When we do have a society that is racialized, but we use the language of class to talk about race. So I'm kind of like looking at this period of when the Chilean state colonized indigenous Mapuche lands in the late 19th century and brought in German migrants and farmers to take over those lands, and how did that shift the racial kind of language and matrix, and how were the Mapuche directly impacted by it? So,
okay. And your dissertation was tied into education as well, right, in that same area?
Yeah, so I use education as a lens to analyze these like racial hierarchies that are being constructed, right? So what was the experience for Mapuche children at mission schools, but what was their experience at the public high school? Also, how did those experiences inform their politics? If you went to the public high school, which was seen as prestigious at the time, because, 19th century, early 20th century, barely anyone got a high school education or completed it, right? So they tend to be much more, their politics, I would say, was much more moderate than those children, Mapuche children who went through the mission schools. Like, they were